Imagine a country made of hundreds of islands scattered across the vast blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean, a place so remote and so scattered that most people on Earth could not point to it on a map. Yet a place so historically rich, so geopolitically significant, and so culturally fascinating that once you learn about it, you will never forget it. Imagine a land where ancient navigators, thousands of years before the invention of GPS or compasses or any modern instrument, crossed thousands of kilometers of open ocean, using nothing but the stars above them, the feel of ocean currents beneath their canoes, and the invisible patterns of wind that they had memorized over generations of living on and with the sea. Imagine a nation that sits right at the center of one of the most hotly contested geopolitical competitions of the 21st century, a competition between the world's most powerful nations for influence, military access, and strategic dominance in the Pacific region. This is the Federated States of Micronesia, one of the most fascinating, most mysterious, and most overlooked countries on the face of this earth, and today we're going to explore everything about it: its geography, its ancient history, its colonial past, its hard-won independence, its people and culture, its economy, its environmental challenges, and its growing importance in modern global politics. So sit back, because this is going to be a journey unlike any other, a journey across one of the most incredible corners of our planet. Let us begin with geography, because to understand Micronesia, you first have to understand just how extraordinary its physical situation actually is. The Federated States of Micronesia is located in the western Pacific Ocean, sitting northeast of Papua New Guinea and east of the Philippines, right in the heart of a vast oceanic region that humans have called home for thousands of years. The country is made up of approximately 607 islands, and these islands are spread across nearly 2,900 kilometers of open ocean, which means that if you were to travel from one end of this country to the other, you would cover a distance roughly equivalent to traveling across the entire continental United States from east to west. Yet, despite spanning this enormous stretch of ocean, the total land area of the Federated States of Micronesia is only about 700 square kilometers, which makes it one of the smallest countries on Earth by land area. These islands are part of what is known as the Caroline Islands Archipelago, a chain of tropical islands that have been shaped over millions of years by volcanic activity and coral reef formation. The surrounding ocean territory, however, is enormous, giving Micronesia one of the largest exclusive economic zones in the entire Pacific, a fact that has enormous implications for its fishing industry, its economy, and its geopolitical importance. But we will get to all of that in detail later. For now, just try to picture this extraordinary landscape. Hundreds of small tropical islands, some high and volcanic, some low and flat, some barely rising above the surface of the ocean, all surrounded by some of the clearest, most biodiverse waters on the planet, and all separated from each other by vast stretches of open sea that would challenge even the most experienced modern sailor. The country is organized into 4 distinct states, and each of these states has its own character, its own language, its own traditions, and its own relationship with the ocean and the land. The 4 states are Yap, Chuuk, Pohnpei, and Kosrae. Yap is perhaps the most traditional of the 4, a place where ancient customs are still very much alive, where people still practice forms of traditional navigation, where the famous stone money known as rai can still be found. Massive circular stones with holes carved through their centers that were once used as a form of currency and are still respected as symbols of wealth and social status today. Chuuk, which was formerly known as Truk, is a place that has become world famous among a very specific community, namely scuba divers and underwater explorers. Because lying on the floor of Chuuk Lagoon are the rusting hulks of dozens of Japanese warships, supply vessels, and aircraft that were sunk during a massive American military operation in World War II. And these shipwrecks, now covered in coral and teeming with marine life, form one of the most extraordinary underwater landscapes anywhere on the planet. Pohnpei is the largest island in the Federation, and it is home to the national capital, a town called Palakir. And it is also home to some of the most dramatic scenery in all of Micronesia, with lush rainforest-covered mountains rising steeply from the coast, and some of the highest rainfall of any place on Earth. And then there is Kosrae, the smallest and most isolated of the 4 states, a quiet island with a deeply religious community, beautiful coral reefs, and its own unique history and culture. That sets it apart from the rest of the Federation. Together, these 4 states form a nation that is extraordinarily diverse for its size, a place where you can travel from island to island and feel as though you are entering an entirely different world each time. Now, let us go back in time, far back, to the very beginning of human history in this part of the Pacific, because the story of Micronesia begins not a few hundred years ago, but thousands of years in the past. Archaeological and linguistic evidence suggests that humans first settled these islands approximately 3,500 years ago, which means that people were living on these remote Pacific islands long before the ancient Romans built their empire, long before the construction of many of the great monuments of the ancient world, and long before Europeans had any concept that the Pacific Ocean even existed. The people who first settled Micronesia were part of the Great Austronesian Migration, one of the most remarkable movements in all of human history, in which people from the area of what is now Taiwan and Southeast Asia gradually spread eastward across the Pacific, island by island, generation by generation, using nothing but their canoes, their knowledge of the stars, and their extraordinary understanding of the ocean to find and settle some of the most remote places on Earth. The early Micronesians were, without any exaggeration, among the greatest navigators and sailors that the world has ever seen. In an age when most civilizations were barely venturing beyond the sight of their own coastlines, these Pacific navigators were regularly crossing thousands of kilometers of open ocean, finding tiny specks of land in the middle of the world's largest ocean, and doing so with a degree of precision and reliability that modern experts still find astonishing. How did they do it? The answer is that they developed an extraordinarily sophisticated system of navigation that relied on careful, detailed observation of the natural world. They learned to read the stars, not just identifying a few bright ones, but memorizing the positions and movements of hundreds of stars across the entire night sky, using them as a kind of celestial map that told them not just which direction they were heading, but also their latitude and their position relative to specific islands and destinations. They learned to read ocean currents, understanding that different currents flow in different directions, and that by feeling the movement of water beneath their canoe, they could determine which current they were in and what direction it was taking them. They learned to read wind patterns, understanding the seasonal shifts in wind direction that made certain voyages possible at certain times of year and impossible at others. They learned to read wave patterns, understanding that islands disturb the natural swell patterns of the ocean in ways that can be detected from far away, allowing a skilled navigator to feel the presence of land even before it was visible on the horizon. Some navigators even used physical tools to help them understand ocean swell patterns, most notably the stick charts used by navigators in the Marshall Islands, which were made by weaving together curved sticks to represent the patterns of ocean swells around different islands and could be used as a kind of tactile map of the ocean. This navigation knowledge was not written down, but was passed from generation to generation through oral teaching, through apprenticeship, through practical experience on the water. And it represented one of the most complex and sophisticated bodies of scientific knowledge developed by any pre-industrial civilization anywhere in the world. This navigational tradition produced a culture that was deeply connected to the ocean, that saw the sea not as a barrier, but as a highway, not as a danger to be avoided, but as the very substance of life itself. Micronesian communities depended on the ocean for food, for trade, for communication, for their entire way of life. And this deep relationship with the sea shaped every aspect of their culture, from their social structures, to their religious beliefs, to their artistic traditions. Fishing was not just an economic activity, but a sacred one, surrounded by ritual and ceremony and governed by complex rules about where, when, and how fish could be caught. Canoe building was not just a technical skill, but an art form, and master canoe builders occupied a position of great respect and status within their communities. The ocean was woven into every story, every song, every ceremony, every aspect of daily life in a way that is difficult for people from landlocked or coastal civilizations to fully appreciate. It is against this background of ancient navigational achievement and deep oceanic culture that we must understand one of the most remarkable and mysterious archaeological sites in the entire Pacific, a place called Nan Madol. Nan Madol is located on the island of Pohnpei, and it is without question one of the most extraordinary ancient sites anywhere on Earth. It was built on a series of artificial islands constructed in a shallow lagoon on the southeastern coast of Pohnpei, and it consists of nearly 100 artificial islets separated by a network of tidal canals, giving rise to its popular nickname, the Venice of the Pacific. The structures at Nan Madol were built using massive blocks of basalt, a volcanic stone that occurs naturally on Pohnpei, in the form of long hexagonal columns. And some of these blocks weigh as much as 50 tons. The builders of Nan Madol somehow transported these enormous stone columns from their natural deposits on other parts of the island to the construction site, somehow floated them or dragged them into position, and somehow stacked them up to form walls and platforms that still stand today, more than 700 years after they were built. Archaeologists believe that Nan Madol served as the ceremonial and political center of the Saudeleur dynasty, a ruling family that controlled much of Pohnpei from around 1100 to 1628 CE, and that the site included temples, royal residences, and ceremonial spaces used for rituals connected to the religious and political life of the community. But many aspects of Nan Madol remain deeply puzzling. How exactly were those enormous stone blocks transported and lifted into place without any of the machinery or engineering technology that we would consider necessary for such a task today? What specific rituals took place in the various different parts of the complex? What was the daily life of the people who lived and worked there? These questions continue to fascinate and challenge researchers. and Nan Madol was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2016 in recognition of its extraordinary historical and cultural significance. From this ancient world, we now must turn to a darker chapter in Micronesian history. The era of colonial domination that transformed these islands from independent and self-governing communities into possessions of a succession of distant foreign powers. The first European to make contact with the Caroline Islands was the Spanish explorer Diego de Rocha, who passed through the area in 1525, and for the next several centuries the Spanish maintained a nominal claim over these islands, though they made relatively little effort to actually colonize or administer them. Spanish missionaries did arrive in the late 17th century and made some attempts to convert the islanders to Christianity, but these early missionary efforts were often violently resisted by the local population, and Spain never established the kind of firm colonial control over Micronesia that it had over many other parts of its empire. This changed in the latter part of the 19th century, when the great European powers began to scramble more aggressively for colonial possessions around the world. In 1885, Germany and Spain became involved in a direct dispute over the Caroline Islands, each claiming the right to control them. And the matter was eventually settled by Pope Leo III, who mediated between the two powers and awarded the islands to Spain, while granting Germany trading rights in the area. But Spanish control was not to last long, following Spain's defeat in the Spanish-American War of 1898, in which it lost Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines to the United States. Spain found itself in a much weakened position and chose to sell its remaining Pacific possessions, including the Caroline Islands, to Germany. Germany took formal control of the Caroline Islands in 1899 and administered them as part of German New Guinea, focusing primarily on economic exploitation through copper production and phosphate mining. German control of Micronesia was itself short-lived. When World War I broke out in 1914, Japan, which was at that time allied with Britain and its partners against Germany, quickly moved to seize Germany's Pacific Island possessions. And by the end of 1914, Japanese forces had occupied the Caroline Islands, the Marshall Islands, and the Mariana Islands. After the war ended in 1918, the League of Nations officially awarded Japan a mandate to administer these islands, and Japan proceeded to develop them in a way that served Japanese imperial interests, establishing large numbers of Japanese settlers on some of the islands, building military infrastructure, developing agricultural plantations, and integrating the islands into the broader Japanese imperial economy. The indigenous Micronesian population found themselves increasingly marginalized in their own homeland as the number of Japanese settlers grew to outnumber them on some islands. Then came World War II, and the Pacific became the scene of some of the most brutal and intense fighting of the entire conflict. Many of the islands of Micronesia were heavily fortified by Japan and became the targets of major American military operations, including the famous Operation Hailstone in February 1944, the massive air and sea attack on the Japanese base at Truk Lagoon that destroyed much of the Japanese naval and air force there and left dozens of ships and aircraft on the floor of the lagoon, creating the underwater graveyard that would later become world famous among divers. By the end of the war, the United States had captured or isolated most of the Japanese island bases in Micronesia, and when Japan surrendered in 1945, the islands came under American control. The United States administered Micronesia under a United Nations Trust Territory arrangement known as the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands, which gave the U.S. responsibility for governing the islands while theoretically working toward preparing them for eventual self-governance. American administration brought significant changes to Micronesia, including the establishment of a modern education system, improvements in healthcare and infrastructure, and the gradual development of political institutions. But it was also marked by a period of profound controversy. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States conducted 67 nuclear weapons tests in the Marshall Islands, including some of the largest nuclear explosions ever set off. And while the Marshall Islands are not technically part of the Federated States of Micronesia, the nuclear testing program cast a long shadow over the entire region and remains a source of deep resentment and mistrust toward the United States among many Pacific Islanders to this day. In Micronesia itself, the American period saw growing demands for self-determination, and after years of negotiations, the different parts of the Trust Territory chose different political paths. The Northern Mariana Islands chose to become a U.S. Commonwealth. The Marshall Islands and Palau became separate independent nations, and the four states of Yap, Chuuk, Pohnpei, and Kosrae chose to unite as the Federated States of Micronesia. The Federated States of Micronesia adopted its constitution in 1979, a moment of enormous significance for a people who had spent centuries under the control of foreign powers. The constitution established a federal system with a national government and four state governments, a unicameral Congress with representatives elected from each state, and a president who serves as both head of state and head of government. The country became fully independent in 1986, but at the same time it entered into a special relationship with the United States through an agreement known as the Compact of Free Association. This compact is a complex and somewhat unusual arrangement that reflects both the historical relationship between the two countries and the practical realities of a tiny, remote island nation trying to survive in a complex and competitive world. Under the terms of the compact, the United States provides substantial financial assistance to Micronesia, funding a significant portion of the government budget and supporting development projects across the islands. In return, the United States takes responsibility for the defense and security of Micronesia, meaning that the U.S. military is obligated to protect the country if it comes under attack and has the right to operate military facilities in the country if needed. Citizens of Micronesia are also granted the right to live and work freely in the United States without needing a visa, a right that has been exercised by a substantial number of Micronesians who have migrated to Hawaii, Guam, and the continental United States in search of economic opportunities. The compact has been renewed and renegotiated several times since 1986, most recently with a new agreement that extends U.S. financial support through 2043, and it remains the central pillar of Micronesian foreign policy and economic life. The population of the Federated States of Micronesia is approximately 100,000 people, making it one of the smaller nations in the world by population, and this small population is divided among the 4 states and spread across dozens of inhabited islands. The major ethnic groups reflect the 4 states, with the Chuukese being the largest group, followed by the Pohnpeian, the Yapese, and the Kozrean, each with their own distinct language, cultural traditions, and sense of identity. English is the official national language and is used in government, education, and inter-island communication. But in daily life, most people speak their own local languages, and linguistic diversity is one of the defining characteristics of Micronesian society. Religion plays an extremely important role in Micronesian life, and the vast majority of the population is Christian, a legacy of the intensive missionary activity that took place during the colonial period, particularly by American Protestant missionaries in the 19th century and Catholic missionaries as well. But while Christianity has been fully embraced by most Micronesians, it has also been woven together with traditional cultural practices and beliefs in ways that create something distinctively Micronesian, rather than simply a copy of Western Christianity. Most people in Micronesia live in small coastal villages, and the rhythms of village life, centered on family, community, fishing, farming, and religious observance, remain the foundation of Micronesian society even as modern influences from the internet, television, and contact with the wider world continue to grow. The economy of the Federated States of Micronesia is small and faces significant challenges, but it has several important pillars that sustain it. The most economically significant sector is fishing, particularly tuna fishing, as the waters of Micronesia are among the most productive tuna fishing grounds in the entire world. The country earns substantial revenue from licensing fees paid by foreign fishing fleets from Japan, the United States, China, and other countries for the right to fish in its exclusive economic zone. And this fishing revenue represents one of the most important sources of government income. Agriculture also plays an important role in local food production and subsistence living, with the main crops including coconuts, from which copra is produced for export, as well as bananas, cassava, taro, and a variety of tropical fruits and vegetables. But despite these resources, the Micronesian economy remains heavily dependent on foreign aid, primarily from the United States through the Compact of Free Association, which funds a large portion of the government budget and supports public services, including education, healthcare, and infrastructure. This dependence on aid creates a complex dynamic, giving Micronesia financial stability, but also limiting its economic independence and creating ongoing questions about what will happen when the current compact eventually expires. Tourism is another sector with significant potential, particularly given the extraordinary natural beauty of the islands and the world-famous diving opportunities in Chuuk Lagoon, where divers can explore the ghost fleet of Japanese warships from World War II, swimming through the rusting holds of cargo ships and the cockpits of sunken aircraft, while surrounded by colorful coral and tropical fish. But developing tourism infrastructure on remote Pacific islands is expensive and logistically challenging, and so far the sector has not reached its full potential. Now we must talk about one of the most important and most urgent issues facing Micronesia today, and indeed one of the most urgent issues facing the entire world, which is climate change and its specific and devastating impact on low-lying Pacific Island nations. The Federated States of Micronesia faces an existential threat from climate change that is more immediate and more concrete than almost anywhere else on Earth. Rising sea levels, driven by the melting of polar ice caps and the thermal expansion of warming ocean water, are already beginning to affect low-lying islands in Micronesia, causing increased coastal flooding, saltwater intrusion into freshwater supplies and agricultural land, and erosion of beaches and coastal infrastructure. Some of the lowest lying islands and atolls in the country may become genuinely uninhabitable within the coming decades if current trends continue, forcing the displacement of their entire populations. Beyond sea level rise, Micronesia is also experiencing more intense tropical storms, more severe coral bleaching events that threaten the health of the reef ecosystems that the country depends on for food and coastal protection, and increasingly unpredictable rainfall patterns that affect freshwater availability. The government of Micronesia has been one of the most vocal advocates for strong global action on climate change in international forums, recognizing that the survival of their nation ultimately depends on decisions made in faraway capitals about how quickly the world transitions away from fossil fuels. This advocacy has sometimes put Micronesia in conflict with more powerful nations that have been reluctant to make strong commitments on climate action. And it has added a layer of urgency and moral weight to the country's participation in international diplomacy that is disproportionate to its size and power. Speaking of international diplomacy and geopolitics, let us now turn to what may be the most immediately relevant aspect of Micronesia's situation from a global perspective, which is its growing strategic importance in the context of intensifying competition between the United States and China for influence and military advantage in the Pacific. The Pacific Ocean is the largest ocean on Earth, covering more than a third of the surface of the planet. And control of or access to the islands scattered across it has enormous military and strategic implications. The United States has maintained a dominant position in the Pacific since the end of World War II, with military bases in Hawaii, Guam, and Japan forming the backbone of its Pacific military presence, and the Compact of Free Association with Micronesia has been an important part of this strategic architecture, giving the U.S. the right to deny access to Micronesian waters and airspace to third-party military forces, a provision that has taken on new significance as China has built up its naval capabilities and begun to project military power further into the Pacific. China, for its part, has been actively courting Pacific Island nations with offers of infrastructure investment, trade deals, and diplomatic recognition, seeking to build influence in a region that the United States has traditionally dominated. In 2022, China signed a security agreement with the Solomon Islands that alarmed both the United States and Australia, and there have been ongoing concerns about Chinese efforts to establish a more permanent military or naval presence in the Pacific. Micronesia, sitting as it does right in the middle of this competition, has found itself in a position of unexpected geopolitical importance, courted by both sides and forced to navigate carefully between the competing interests of the world's two most powerful nations. The renewal of the Compact of Free Association, with updated and more generous financial terms, reflects in part the United States government's recognition that maintaining strong relationships with Pacific Island nations is a strategic priority in the context of this competition with China. The culture of Micronesia is rich, diverse, and remarkably resilient, having survived centuries of colonial disruption, foreign rule, and modernizing pressure while retaining much of its distinctive character. Traditional canoe building and navigation remain important cultural practices, and there have been significant revival efforts in recent decades to preserve and transmit the ancient navigational knowledge that was nearly lost during the colonial period. The traditional canoe, whether the flying proa of Yap or the tipnol of the outer islands, is not just a boat, but a cultural symbol, a connection to ancestors and to a way of life built on the ocean. Fishing communities maintain traditions and ceremonies connected to the sea, including specific rituals performed before important fishing voyages and protocols governing the distribution of the catch within the community. Storytelling and oral history remain central to cultural life, with knowledge about history, genealogy, navigation, and social norms passed down through carefully maintained oral traditions. Traditional dancing and ceremonies mark important moments in the life cycle and the community calendar, and while these have in some places been influenced by or adapted to Christian practices, they retain a distinctively Micronesian character. The stone money of Yap, the Rai, deserves special mention as one of the most extraordinary monetary systems ever developed by any human society. These massive circular stones, some of them 3 meters in diameter, were quarried in Palau and transported to Yap on canoes, a journey of several hundred kilometers across open ocean. Their value was determined not just by their size, but by the story of their transportation, particularly the difficulty and danger involved in bringing them to Yap. And this value was recognized by community consensus, rather than by physical possession. Even when a stone was too large to move and sat in one location for generations, its ownership could change through transactions that were recorded in community memory, a system that modern economists have found fascinatingly analogous to certain modern concepts of money and value. Extended family relationships are the foundation of social life in Micronesia, and the obligations and responsibilities that come with family membership permeate every aspect of daily existence. In Micronesian societies, individuals are understood to be deeply embedded in networks of family and community obligation rather than being autonomous individuals in the Western sense. And decisions about work, marriage, migration, and resource use are made with reference to family and community needs as well as individual desires. This strong communal ethic has been both a strength, providing social support and cohesion in the face of hardship, and a source of tension as it can conflict with the demands of modern economic life and individual advancement. Young Micronesians who migrate to the United States often find themselves caught between two very different sets of values and expectations, maintaining obligations to their families back home while also trying to build lives in a society that places much greater emphasis on individual autonomy and achievement. Looking toward the future, the Federated States of Micronesia faces a set of challenges that are unique in their specific combination, but connected to broader questions that many developing island nations are grappling with. Economic development that can reduce dependence on foreign aid while preserving environmental sustainability is perhaps the central challenge, requiring investment in education, infrastructure, and productive sectors, while avoiding the kind of environmental damage that would undermine the very natural assets, clean water, healthy reefs, abundant fish that the islands depend on. Climate adaptation is an existential priority, requiring both mitigation efforts, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and adaptation measures, building seawalls, relocating vulnerable communities, developing drought-resistant food crops that can help the country survive the climate changes that are already locked in, maintaining and strengthening partnerships with sympathetic and supportive nations, particularly the United States, but also Japan, Australia, and others, while preserving the flexibility to engage with a wider range of international partners, is a delicate diplomatic balancing act that requires considerable skill and sophistication. And preserving cultural identity and traditional knowledge in the face of powerful modernizing and globalizing forces is a challenge that touches the deepest questions of what it means to be Micronesian and what kind of future the people of these islands want to build for themselves and their children. The Federated States of Micronesia may appear, at first glance, to be nothing more than a scattering of tiny, remote, and largely unknown islands lost in the immensity of the Pacific. But we hope that this journey through its history, its geography, its culture, and its current situation has shown you something different. This is a place with a history that stretches back thousands of years, a history of extraordinary human achievement in navigation and settlement, of complex and sophisticated civilizations that built mysterious stone cities and developed knowledge systems that rivaled anything in the ancient world. It is a place that has been shaped and reshaped by colonial powers, that has experienced the full force of modern history from World War II to nuclear testing to the Cold War, and that has emerged from all of that as a resilient and independent nation, with a clear sense of its own identity and values. It is a place that sits at the intersection of some of the most important geopolitical forces of our time, where the competition between the world's great powers plays out in negotiations and diplomatic visits and military calculations, and where the global crisis of climate change is not an abstract future threat, but a present and immediate danger to the survival of communities and ways of life that have endured for millennia. And it is a place of extraordinary beauty and biodiversity, where crystal clear waters teem with life, where ancient coral reefs support ecosystems of breathtaking complexity, and where the legacy of ancient navigators lives on in communities that still feel the pull of the ocean in their blood. From the mysterious ruins of Nan Madol, rising from a Pohnpeian lagoon to the ghost fleet of Chuk, sleeping on the floor of the sea, from the stone money of Yap to the navigators who once read the stars with the precision of modern instruments, Micronesia is a place that deserves to be known, understood, and celebrated. And we hope that after watching this video, you will agree.